The scream of the stagecoach wheels cut through the frozen air like a blade. Inside the coach, Clara Jenkins sat alone, shaking with the cold and the hard jolts of the road. She was only 18. She wore a lace wedding dress that had once seemed beautiful in a warm St. Louis shop. Now the thin ivory lace was stiff with frost, and her new leather shoes felt like ice blocks tied to her feet. Outside the small window, the Montana Territory looked dead and colorless under the fading light of an 1870s winter evening. The coach jerked to a stop in what barely passed for a town. Bears Hollow was not a place, but a scar in the snow. A few rough wooden buildings leaned against the wind like tired men. "End of the line, miss," the driver shouted. He did not open the door. Clara gathered her small carpet bag and stepped down into dirty packed snow as the wind slapped her veil across her face. The driver dropped her trunk onto the platform, pointed toward a building, and left without another word. Clara stood alone. Men wrapped in heavy coats stared at her from the shadows. Their eyes were cold and curious. The wedding dress that was meant to protect her did the opposite. She felt exposed. She hurried into the depot, a small room overheated by a pot-bellied stove. A thin man with wire glasses looked up from a ledger. "I am here to meet Mr. Amos Reed," Clara said softly. "He sent for me." The man's eyes softened with pity. "Miss Jenkins," he said slowly, "I am afraid Mr. Reed passed on." The words made no sense at first. "Passed on?" she whispered. "He is dead," the man said. "A fight at the saloon 2 nights ago." The room tilted. Clara backed into the wall. She had not known Amos Reed. She only knew the letters and the agreement made by her desperate father. She had crossed 1,000 miles to be a bride. Now there was no groom, no home, no protection. Only a town full of hard men and 12 cents in her purse. "There is work for a woman here," the depot agent said carefully. "At the saloon." Clara understood. Her stomach twisted. "No," she said. "I cannot." "You cannot stay here," he replied, already turning away. She fled back into the street as the wind howled louder. Piano music drifted from the saloon. 2 drunk miners stepped into her path, laughing. One grabbed her arm, tearing the lace at her sleeve. Panic exploded inside her. She pulled free and ran, slipping on the ice, ducking into a dark alley that stank of rot and filth. Heavy boots followed. A large man blocked the alley entrance, smiling with mean intent. He grabbed her, crushing her against the frozen wall. His breath burned her face. She screamed, fought, and felt the lace rip again. Fear swallowed her whole. "Let her go!" The voice was low and flat. Another man stood at the mouth of the alley, tall, still, dangerous in his calm. The miner hesitated, then shoved Clara away and disappeared into the street. Clara collapsed into the snow, shaking and crying. The stranger did not touch her. He studied her torn dress and her terror with cold gray eyes. "A storm's coming," he said. "You stay here, you'll be dead by morning." "Please," she whispered. "Where can I go?" Quote, "I have a cabin in the hills," he said. "Shelter. Ride with me or freeze." There was no real choice, she nodded. The ride into the mountains was misery. The cold burrowed into her bones until she went numb. The man did not speak. His arm held her steady on the saddle like iron. When the horse finally stopped, she could barely stand. He carried her inside a small shack buried in snow. 1 room, 1 stove, 1 bed. He lit the fire and turned his back to her. "Get warm," he said. "You'll lose a foot." She stood by the stove, trembling. Darkness fell. The storm screamed outside. At last she asked where she should sleep. Without a word, he took a blanket and lay down on the floor by the door with his rifle across his chest. "Take the bed," he said. She crawled onto the cot without removing her ruined dress or shoes. The quilt smelled of smoke and pine. The silence was heavy. When the weight of the day finally broke her, Clara cried. Quiet at first, then, shaking sobs she could not stop. The man listened from the darkness and said nothing. By morning, the storm had only grown worse. When she tried to leave, he opened the door to a wall of white. She stepped back in fear. "You cannot go," he said simply, and barred the door again. She was trapped with him. As the fire crackled back to life, Clara realized the truth. She had not escaped danger. She had only stepped into something unknown. And she did not know if this quiet, scarred man named Silas would be her salvation or her next fear. The storm did not stop. It howled for days, turning the small cabin into an island of wood and fire surrounded by white emptiness. Clara learned the sound of the wind changing pitch and the way the snow pressed against the walls like a living thing. Inside, the cabin stayed cold, but it was alive. Silas rose before the light each morning, rebuilt the fire, and went out to check his horse and traps. He moved like a man who wasted nothing, not steps, not words. Clara kept busy. She melted snow for water, scrubbed the tin cups, swept the dirt floor with a broom made of branches. She worked until her hands were raw. She did not sit still. She was afraid that if she stopped, fear would find her again. Silas watched her without comment. He noticed how she flinched when he moved too fast. He noticed how she kept the fire alive. He began to clear his throat before crossing the room. He began to move slower. They spoke little. When they did, the words were plain. "Wood is low," he would say. "Coffee is hot," she would answer. It was not kindness, but it was safety. It was enough. One night, as the storm screamed outside, Clara finally asked, "Why do you live out here alone?" Silas did not answer right away. He stared at the fire, his scar catching the light. "I was married," he said at last. "She left, went west with my brother." The words fell heavy. Clara felt the truth in them. He had not just been left, he had been replaced. The quiet inside him made sense now. She nodded and said nothing. Silence was their shared language. Days passed. The storm eased, then roared again. Food ran low. When the wind finally softened, Silas said he would go to town for supplies. Panic rose in Clara's chest. She begged to go with him. He refused, his voice firm but not cruel. "You're safer here." He barred the door from the outside and left. Alone, the cabin felt different. Empty. The silence pressed in. Clara paced, then stopped in front of a small wooden chest she had never opened. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid. Inside were folded shirts, a razor, a few letters tied with string. Beneath them was a leather-bound book. She opened it and gasped. The pages were filled with charcoal drawings of horses. Wild ones. Powerful ones. Manes flying, eyes alive. Not the calm horse Silas rode, but the spirit beneath it. She understood then. He was not empty. He was full of things he never spoke. She closed the book and waited. When Silas returned, he brought supplies in her trunk from the depot. Clara could not speak. He had gone back for her life. That night, the cabin felt warmer. Later, sitting by the fire, Clara told him the truth about Amos Reed, about the woman in the room, about the fear. Silas listened without moving. When she finished, he said only one thing. "You ain't his, you're yours." The words settled deep. A few nights later, fear returned with teeth. Clara woke, shaking from a dream of hands and laughter. She sat on the edge of the cot, breathing hard. In the dim light, she saw Silas sitting by the door, his belt resting on the stool beside him. Thick leather, heavy buckle, a thing of power. Her body moved before her mind did. She slid from the cot and crossed the floor on her knees. She stopped in front of him and reached out, touching the belt with trembling fingers. She held it, testing him. Silas went still. He did not stop her. He did not speak. He let her hold it until her breathing slowed. When she released it, he unbuckled the belt himself and placed it away, out of reach. He lay down and turned his back to her. That night, she slept without crying. The next day, the storm finally broke. Sunlight filled the cabin, sharp and bright. Silas went to town again. When he returned, his face was hard. "They are looking for you," he said, "Reed's brothers, with the law." Fear flashed, then burned out. Clara went to her trunk, pulled out the wedding dress and carried it outside. She burned it until nothing remained but ash. "We leave," Silas said. They traveled west through snow and river and pain. They slept under trees. They crossed freezing water tied together by rope. Clara grew stronger. She did not flinch now. When they reached a logging camp, Silas claimed her as his wife. The word protected her like a shield. Life settled again, rough but real. Until the past found them. Ethan Reed arrived at the camp. He grabbed Clara. Silas fought him. Blood spilled. Clara took the gun and aimed it with shaking hands. The marshal arrived. The law chose them. Silas was wounded badly. Clara stitched him by the fire, her hands steady. When it was done, she sat beside him, fear gone at last. "I want this," she said softly. "I want you." Silas looked at her with raw honesty. "I want your first time to be yours," he said. "Not fear, not payment." She nodded, understanding, and for the first time in her life, Clara felt something she had never known. Choice. Silas healed slowly. The cut along his ribs burned for weeks, and the scar on his arm pulled tight when he swung an axe. Clara stayed close, changing bandages, keeping the fire steady, watching his face for pain. He let her care for him without pride. In that small cabin near the logging camp, something quiet and strong grew between them. Not fear, not need, trust. When he could stand again, Silas returned to work. He rose before dawn and came back after dark, tired and sore, but lighter somehow. Clara made the cabin a home. She scrubbed the floor, cooked what little they had, and mended his clothes with small, neat stitches. The campmen tipped their hats to her. They called her ma'am. No one stared too long. No one touched her arm. At night they shared the narrow bed, not as strangers hiding from the world, but as two people choosing to be close. Silas never rushed her. He waited. He watched. He listened to her breathing in the dark. When she finally reached for him again, it was steady, not shaking. There was pain, yes, and tears, but there was also something new. Safety. Care. Her first time was not taken. It was given. And when it hurt, Silas held her and did not move until she said she was ready. He stayed with her through every breath. Spring came fast. Snow melted into rushing water. The world turned green. Silas's strength returned, and with it, his smile. It came slowly, like the thaw, but it stayed. One evening, sitting by the fire, he told her they should leave the camp. This place was shelter, he said, not a future. Clara agreed. There was nothing behind them worth returning to. Together, they used their savings to buy a small piece of land high in a meadow where a clear creek ran and tall pines stood like guards. They built a cabin from the ground up. Silas taught her how to notch logs and fit stone. Clara learned fast. Her hands grew strong. Their cabin had 2 windows so light could enter from morning to dusk. They built a wide bed under the south window. They built it together. Life settled into a steady rhythm. Hard work, quiet evenings, shared meals. Clara planted a small garden. Silas checked snares and hunted. Some nights he drew horses again by the fire, and Clara watched his hands move with care. She understood that he had always been gentle. The world had just never been gentle with him. One afternoon, a rider came down the trail. Clara felt fear for only a moment. Then she stood tall. It was the marshal. He tipped his hat and told them the truth. Ethan Reed had left the territory and never returned. The papers were gone. The bounty was gone. No one would come for her again. When the marshal rode away, Clara leaned into Silas. "It's over," she said. "Yes," he replied. "It is." Summer warmed the meadow. Laughter came easier. One evening, Clara found Silas's old belt hanging on a peg by the door. The same belt she had once held in terror. She touched it now without fear and smiled. Symbols only had power. if you let them. Later that night, she took the belt down and set it aside. She climbed into bed beside him and rested her head on his chest. "It doesn't scare me anymore," she said. Silas kissed her hair. "Good," he said. "It never should have." Years passed. The cabin aged, but they grew stronger. Travelers who passed through the meadow spoke of a quiet man with a scar and a woman who met the world with calm eyes. They spoke of a place that felt safe. Clara Jenkins, once a frightened girl in a frozen wedding dress, became Clara of the meadow, a woman who chose her life, a woman who was never owned. And Silas, the man who once lived alone in the cold hills, learned that broken things could be mended. Together, they built something that lasted.